right. So with Professor Albert, we have looked at different species that are found in the delta. Now we're going deep into the fish. Let's look at the parasites. I'm so curious to learn about the parasites of fish. So we have Professor Luizo. Professor Luizo is a parasite researcher who uses tiny organisms to monitor the health of the delta. So welcome on the screen, Professor Luizo.
Hi, Stella. Thank you. To double check, you and the students can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you.
And you can see my screen.
Yes,
Good.
perfect.
So because we're talking of fish, in South Africa, and it's going to get back to the Botswana's national fish, the galjoen is the national fish of South Africa, which is a marine fish. And it's also a game fighter fish. And you can see there, it gets up to 7 kilograms in size. Now to the Botswana students, what is your national fish? Can you quickly answer on what is your national fish? Because in preparation for this presentation, I could not find 100% confirmation that even Botswana has a national fish. But first of all, also, what is your national tree? Do you know that? The national tree of Botswana is the marula, and we actually say it wrongly when we speak about it. It's supposed to be the morula if we're following the Setswana word for it. So it's an indigenous tree that's from parts of Africa, and besides the fact that it's also consumed by us, it's also be consumed by giraffes, rhinos, and elephants. One of the interesting things that I saw about this tree is that the fruit of it, the vitamin C value of it is actually higher than we have in the case of oranges. I'm going to just fast forward a little bit. Botswana students, what is your national bird? Do you know? It is the Corybastard, or in Afrikaans, a gompo, and we were very lucky on one of the trips that we actually came back to South Africa, we saw one of them along the road. What is scary is if we're looking at the conservation status of the Corybastard, which is actually near threatened. Now back to what is Botswana's national fish. I am not 100% sure.
Tiger fish? Okay.
What's the answer?
They say tiger fish. I'm just relaying their answer.
Okay. I'm also not 100% sure because I could not find information that it must be the tiger fish. Now, both Albert and Paul spoke about the Synodontis, and for me, it's a very special fish you will see just now. So maybe if Botswana must have a national fish, it's something that the students can start with, and you can have one of your game fighters, either the thin-faced largemouth or even the tiger fish as part of your national fish. Having a national fish is not so far-fetched, and even if we're looking at the book that Paul, Glenn Merrin and Mike Bruton wrote a couple of years ago on the fishes of the Okavango, you will see even on the cover page of their book, it was the squeaker, as well as the bream, and then the tigerfish. And a couple of years ago, there's a very famous couple in Botswana, Tim and June Liverset, that has been involved with wildlife filming and photography. And a couple of years ago, he was also part with a series of stamps for Botswana. And you can see there, it was the Nemwe, which is one of the bream species, again, the tigerfish, then there's Synodontis, and then one of the other fish species, the African pike, which is also endemic to the Botswana systems. Now, in preparation for this talk, because we're talking about fish and the influence that we as humans have also on the environment, I walked around in our house and I started looking everything that I have around me concerning fish and stuff that has been accumulated over a number of years. And the pictures that you see there of the fishes of nothing really special, is just it was nice pictures for us. Some of the wood carvings is actually ones that we bought way up in Itatsa, and there on the in the corner you will even see some of the Botswana baskets, and then you will see here earrings that I have, which is actually a sunfish, and then that bracelet with the fish I bought in Maun a couple of years ago. So even working on fish, it's really part of my life, and it's actually amazing how fish are a part of our lives in general. I also looked what I have in my house concerning other fishy things. The set at the bottom with the blue fish on it was actually an entire dinner set that I inherited from my mother-in-law. The white container I bought a couple of years ago, even in a second-hand shop. And then the glass plate there is what a friend brought for me from Thailand. So regardless of what just me working on fish, fish is really part of our life. Now, to get to the story about the parasites, I'm going to quickly jump over these questions also, and that will be the theme of the presentation, is what is a parasite? Why is it necessary to study fish parasites, alien parasites, parasites in an ecological context, and then I'm going to end off with parasite conservation. And Albert, you're going to see why your food web was wrong, that you used a picture of Morsipela because you don't have parasites in your food web. So first of all, what is a parasite? So if we're looking at the origin of the word of parasite, we take it back to the Greek language as well, except that initially we did not refer to it in the context of animals living and surviving from another animals. It was used in the context of the people living in the different temples. Also, when the Latin language started using the word parasite, it's sort of still had a little bit of that Greekness on it, still not referring to the connection of one organism living on another organism. Okay, if we're looking at the official definition and the more scientific definition of a parasite, and for that we can follow also the biological dictionary, we will see that it is an organism that relies on other organisms in some way on then the host in which it derives its food. And then most of the time, not always, it will be and can be then harmful in this specific association. Another thing that we have to remember and taking into consideration when we think about fish parasites also is that we have more animals that lives in some kind of an association than we have free living organisms. And it's articles that has been written already for a number of years. If we're looking at, for us, at humans, we will see that we also have more than one parasite taxa that actually infect us as well. Excuse. There we go. Also, to understand the evolutionary development and co-evolution that we have with our parasites, we need to take in consideration even us, and I'm going to use humans as an example before we're jumping over to the fish. With the short time that we have had on Earth, there's roughly about 300 worm species that do infect humans, and about 70 different protozoan species, that's unicellular organisms that infect us as humans, with roughly 90% of them that we found quite common. You will see there the words that you find in red, that is the helminth worms, and the ones in blue, that is the protozoans that infects humans. And I'll refer later quickly back to the guinea worm, as well as elephantiasis, eyeworm, bilharzia. With all the surveys that we have done over the years in Botswana, we have traced bilharzia in animals. We have not found bilharzia in humans anymore. And then also sleeping sickness and malaria, which is also something that is prevalent in malaria as well. If we now look into why specific fish parasites, and Paul also touched on this a little bit about the origin of fish. If we're looking at the geological time scale, we will see that fish have been around for quite a number of years, more than 400 million years. An interesting thing to also observe about fish is that the shape and the form of fish stayed the same throughout its entire evolutionary development. And then in the tertiary period, that is the last 100 million years, we had this massive explosion and diversification of fish species. So that then led to the really, really large diversity of fish that we found currently with us. Now, to take it back to the Okavango Delta, and this is where it's so wonderful to live on the African continent. We have more than 3,000 fish species in the African continent. Europe has around about 200 fish species. The amazing thing is that even in Africa, we still describe new fish species, and that connects to what Albert was saying concerning the need for fish taxonomists to really get to the bottom of the fish species that we have. We'll focus on the family Mochokidae, which is one of the largest catfish families that we found in Africa. You'll see this specifically with the genus Synodontis, the one that's swimming upside down there, with about 130 species. The majority of them we found in the Congo system, with about 9 to 12 species that we found in the Okavango system. And the entire fish family is also endemic to the African continent. That means it doesn't occur on any other continent at all. If we now link this to the parasite biodiversity, and I did my master's 100 years ago on also a fish parasite from the Branchiorans, where this specific group is also endemic to the African continent. And you can see there on the stamp is the Joel B. Smith Institute, before it was SIAP. And that was also when I met actually Prof. Paul Skelton, because I worked through drums and drums of the pickled fish that they collected in the 70s and 80s in Okavango, the entire Okavango system. And that formed part of my master's studies, which focused on the Branchioran group of Africa. The name Lisakile, and Frank, Albert, sorry, that also connects to the wonderful life and world that we have with in taxonomy, is that we can also create nice names for them and using Latinized names for the fish species. So in the case of Conopeltis lisakile, which was discovered in Lake Lisakile, and then we realized it is also something that occurs in Okavango as well. And working through that pickled fish, I was in the position to collect enough specimens to be able to do a species identification as well. The other message I want to share with the students is please don't burn your bridges, and also keep on collaborating. And that again connects to what Albert is now saying with what they want to do with even fish taxonomy in Africa. So a couple of years ago, the colleagues from the Northwest University, they did surveys in the Pongola system, and they found also a Conopeltis lisakile from the Pongola river system, except it's the Limpopo river system. So the question was, how does something also distribute from one river system to another river system? Taking in consideration that in the Okavango and Upper, we have, as I said, more of the Synodontis species, but then there's one Synodontis zambizensis that doesn't occur in the Okavango system, but it occurs in the Limpopo and Pongola drainage basins. Another species, the spotted quaker, Synodontis nigromaculatus, that is the one that occurs in the Zambezi system as well as the Limpopo system. So that was the root of this fish parasite to also distribute from the one river system to the next to another river system. Another one of the Conopeltis species that we found in Botswana was from the western bottlenose, Mormyris lacerda, where the entire family of the Mormyridae are also endemic to the African continent. And again, the majority of the species we found up in the Congo system. And there you can see the fish parasite, and you need to examine the fish quarterly fresh, because we need the parasite's life, otherwise they climb off and we don't see them. So you can see there's another example of the female. You can see the egg sacs there and the spermathecae that is full. If you look at the bottom pictures, this is the light micrograph and then the scanning electron micrographs. You can see at the tip of the maxilla, it has this scale-studded structure with which they also used to attach to the host of the fish. And then interesting, if you look at the third pair of leg, you can see it looks almost like a scimitar with these very spiny areas that we have in the pot of the leg as well. One of the interesting things that we described in the case of this specific species is that there are territorial behavior between the females and the males. So territorial behavior is something that we recognize of terrestrial animals. We don't, and we see territorial behavior in birds, but we never ever think of even territorial behavior in the case of parasites. And we were in a position to describe that as well. So our collaboration in Okavango, I'll give you some more information on that as now. So that led to us being able to write a review paper of all the parasitic Branchiorans that we did find in the Okavango system. You will also see that it also refers to the Zambezi system. And the advantage also of working with museum material or gathered data over the time is that sometimes you can backtrack to material that you have, and that can follow up a picture as well. So for the students, it's not necessary to always have new material and to go on all these adventurous trips. The value remains also of a material that has been collected in the labs as well. A quick overview of how in the world did we get involved with the Okavango system. And it all started also with SIAP, apart from the fact that I've did my master's with some of the material. In 1996, we received an email from Roger Wilson saying, the fish population in the Okavango is declining. And it was not necessarily because of an increase in a fisherman. It was also the time, this is now the middle 90s, where the river was at its lowest because of a dry season as well. So that is when we started with the Okavango Fish Parasite Project. And now almost 30 years later, we're still involved with it. This map shows some of the activities that we'd had over the couple of years, and I'll quickly run through it as well. You will see the one 2012 with the dotted system up there. Unfortunately, we were never ever in a position to collect in the Okavangos, in the upper part of it, Angola. That was an exploratory trip that we have to also see what might be the potential with it. And the picture that you see there, that brown blob, students, that is the origin of the Okavango Delta there in the highlands of Angola. And Paul also showed it in his slide. If it wasn't for these wonderful tributaries, we would never ever have even a river that flows over here. Albert, you also showed some of the collection of fish. Now in the Lake Ngami, this part of the river, the system was dry for more than 30 years. It started getting a little bit of water in 2008, 2009. That's when it flowed over in the Butete River. It filled up Magadi as well as Lake Gao. So we were able to collect there with the initial water that runs in there. Also, when Lake Ngami started filling up, we saw, again, masses of people swarming in there, collecting the fish, and all of that fish were dried and then bussed out to the rest of Africa. And again, not really the local people surviving or benefiting from it as well. In 1999, we spent for 2 months and we traveled down with the Panhandle section of it. And in 2010, we did also a boat trip with the entire stretch of the Okavango down. Now, this is just a collage of some of our activities. We don't travel light because, as I said, in order for us to study the fish parasites, we have to do everything live. So we made use of the lodges and the facilities there and set up field camps where we do the collections. And then at the bottom picture, that was the barge that we had where we stayed for 2 months and we erected the microscopes on it as well. The last couple of years up in the Panhandle, close to Shakawi, part of the Krokovango crocodile farm, we have a spot in the corner there where we developed a research camp, the Lesideng research facilities, which, well, driven and maintained by us and also with collaboration from other partners that can go up there, and then we can do our field work when we're up there as well. If we're moving on to alien parasites, Albert referred to alien fish. With the alien fish comes in the alien parasites as well. And there's an article that was also published by the Northwest people on the alien freshwater fish in Southern Africa, the distribution, and then the way forward. And part of this article also deals with the number of alien fish parasites that came in with these fish species. You will also see there, it refers to translocations, and it's not even in South Africa. The catfish is not supposed to occur further south than the Orange River system, but it does occur in some of the rivers in the Western Cape because it was translocated there as well. So to show the influence of these alien fish, if we're looking at the common carp, Cyprinus carpio, and obviously any fisherman will tell you, but wow, that is absolutely a prime specimen to be able to quote. This is work we did in collaboration with Nature Conservation. But in the case of the common carp, it was introduced, it started spreading, and we already start seeing Argillus japonicus, which is a japonicus, an alien parasite as well. And it has been spreading now to 9 native host species as well. So together with the Argillus that came in, 6 other parasites also came in with the carp. And another one of them is the anchorworm, Lernaea sapronacea. You can see it has a very robust head with which it protrudes underneath the scales. And then the egg sacs and the thorax will be protruding. The challenge with this is that with these also are that they are responsible for secondary infections as well. And currently we have a situation that some of our smaller tributaries in the Eastern Cape, the native Gellimankies, are currently also endangered due to not just the fact that we have bears in that river system, but also with the spread of the alien parasites. But Botswana, you have your own Lernaea hardingi. That is one of the Lernaeads that we found on the African continent. And what you see here, it's the cloac, again, of one of the Synodontis fish. So we dissected it open and we could remove the anchorworm from there. Now, quickly, to also understand the presence of parasites in a natural habitat, we always refer to the fact that parasites can be overdispersed. This means that in a natural habitat, the parasites will not occur in high numbers. But the moment we start concentrating these parasites and moving over to aquaculture, because it's not a natural habitat even for the fish, that is when we start seeing an increase in the number of the parasites as well. But the initial infection of the parasites to the host can also change. For instance, host viability. We do see that in the case of the catfish that we collected from the rivers, the older they are, they have more and more trematode cysts in them because it builds up and builds up. We also see in some of the fish species, the juveniles will actually have certain parasites on them, and then they disappear in the older fish species as well. Another thing that also plays a role is the susceptibility of the host itself, because the natural reaction of the host in any case will be for the immune system to kick in order for it actually to not be infected with it as all. So this is also the gills of, again, our squeaker fish with work that we did. And you can see there, this is one of the Argacilla species. This is not natural for a fish gill to have more than 300 of these individuals on them. And you can see there, they use the antennae at which they sort of armed around the gill filaments. They are blood feeders, so they also have a proboscis that penetrate through it. So imagine you have something that is in your lungs and is grabbing your lungs and feeding on the alveoli in your lungs. And this is exactly what is happening in the case of the Argacillus as well. If we're looking at parasites in the ecological context, now, and Margolis and Cohn wrote an article that they say, we plead to have parasites in our food webs. And also Hudson wrote an article that he said initially, studying parasites, it was the sole domain of specialists and for people focusing on the life cycle, because some of them has very complicated life cycles, and also to sort out the taxonomic position of it. But things are slowly changing, and we see it that the whole world of parasitology is really coming of age, and it's opening it for other scientists and disciplines to start working with us in order for us to really integrate parasites in their food webs. And Bayer wrote in 2008, but technically it was the logical thing to do and for it to happen. So also, historically, we misunderstood and we did not really work the functioning of parasites in the ecosystems specifically. We also were not 100% sure if parasites really contribute to the biomass of an ecosystem. There's work that has been done in the estuaries where we have trematode life cycles in the estuaries, and it seems like they actually play a bigger role in the biomass of an estuary as what we've known. And it's difficult for us to slot in parasites in the trophic groups and the trophic levels that we know it from a typical food web itself. So we're starting now to really understand and see what is the effect and the significance of these parasites in an ecosystem, because parasites can shape the host population as well as the entire dynamics that we have in a population. it does alter the inter-Pacific competition, and I'm going to show you now how it alters the behavior of some of the hosts, and then also the important drive that it has in biodiversity, and then also how it, in the end, has an influence on the energy flow in a food web as well. To use one or two examples. This is the parasite link that we find, and to show how it works in a food web. What you see here is a cricket, and then is an example of the heron that crawls into the cricket. This heron makes the cricket to jump into the water because for the life cycle to be able to complete, this worm needs to develop in the next intermediate host. So the moment the trout eats the cricket, it digests and the worm will crawl out and the life cycle will changes. We find it also in some of the trematode species where they mature in the tentacles of the snails. So the worm will infest the snail, it will crawl to the tentacles of the snail, where the tentacle of the snail will change in color. The moment it's changing in color, it's much more vibrant. Predatory birds will see the snail, it will eat it, and then the life cycle of the trematode worm will continue. And that is also something that we saw in Botswana. It's work that one of our students also did. So this is the typical life cycle of a trematode worm. So you can see the adult worm will live either in the intestine of the mouth or the mouth of a vertebrate host. The eggs will be released in the water via the feces, or the moment the bird pushes its beak in the water. From that, it develops into a free-swimming meracidium. That meracidium will penetrate the snail. In the snail, it developed into the next stage, that is the cercaria, that are shed again. That cercaria will penetrate a fish where it will encysted, it, and the moment a piscivorous bird eats that fish, the life cycle completes. So what we found in the case of the murmurids is that the trematode worms accumulate on the brain of the fish. And you can also see where one via the eye nerve actually crawled out in it. So what we found in this specific study, because the murmurids are a bit more nocturnal, is that the trematode worm makes the fish a little bit haywire. So they're more active swimming in the daytime than in the nighttime. And again, swimming in the daytime, visible to birds, eat up, and then the life cycle continues. Game time. Students, and there was a question in the chat concerning the protected area of the Okavango Delta. What is a Ramsar site? And do you have information on the Okavango as a Ramsar site? Anybody?
Sorry, if I can chance opinion here, does Ramsar not relate to areas of importance for waterfowl and migratory birds?
Yes. The Ramsar Convention was started in 1971. You can see it there, and it's actually in the little town of Ramsar. And initially, you're 100% correct. It started for the protection of wildlife, wetlands and associated with birds. And later on, we realized but we cannot just conserve birds. If we're going to conserve a wetland, it needs to be a larger section of that as well. So in the case of the Okavango Delta, and also, this is the challenging thing we're having with the Okavango system entirely. The Delta section is protected, the panhandle not. So the feeding source of this system is not protected, but the Delta part is. So in 1996, it was site number 879. So if you're going to the ramsar.org website, it will take you to exactly the information of the specific Ramsar site in that area as well. And just for interest, people always say that nothing happens in Africa and everything is negative. It's not 100% true. If you just look and also going to that website, you will find information of all the Ramsar sites that we have on the African continent, as well as some of the smaller islands of the continent still associated with Africa. But you're 100% correct. It was for the protection of a wetland. Another question. The Okavango Delta has been declared a World Heritage Site. And again, it is actually only the Delta site. So what is the importance? And that was one of the questions Marit had in the quiz in the beginning also. Who knows when the Okavango system became a World Heritage Site? Students? not so long ago in 2014, and 100% correct, it's recognized for its exceptional natural values and biodiversity. And it was the 1000th UNESCO World Heritage Site that has been declared. So this, together with the Ramsar site, puts pressure and responsibility of the Botswana government, but as well as the feeding source of it, because there's other laws that also now protects this system, and we need to abide by those laws as well. Jumping now from this conservation of the system, let's see in the case of parasite conservation. In 2020, Carlson and team wrote an article, A Global Parasite Conservation Plan. And because we also realize conserving parasites is a bit of a difficult issue. We're thinking of parasites, if it's going to have some kind of economic cost, in the case of pathogens that we found associated with crops. And we're starting to think of parasites if it bothers us, if it has a health cost, emerging diseases with wildlife and humans. If we're thinking just in preserving the parasite itself, it's something that never ever came to mind. Also, one of the challenges in the whole picture of conservation is that all these conservationists and even the NGOs, and Paul also referred to them, all of us are working through with a limited of funds, and all of us are scrambling the whole time for funds with it. So then it becomes a bit of a challenge also to exclude or to ignore these parasites. So this is one of the obstacles that we need to overcome, is to realize, yes, certain parasites may have a threat, but not all of them have a threat to any of the ecosystems. So what Carlson did in the article is they have 12 goals for the next decade, and shocking to say we're 5 years away from reaching that, is where they see if we can have 12 different goals to see how we can advance parasite biodiversity conservation through research, through management, as well as through spreading the word of the parasites as well. And I'm not going to do all of them. So they use these 12 goals and they grouped it into 4 themes. Data collection and the synthesis, and this is where the current keep on obtaining information plays an important role. That also connects to what Albert is currently doing at SIAP, is starting to find these hubs where we're starting to have museums and areas to also curate the parasite collections that we have. We're looking at the risk assessment, and the 2 I'm going to focus on is the conservation practice and then the outreach and education, because this is what we do if you're also you're working at the university. So one of the things they wrote and pick up on in the article is that there are certain steps that we have to do to start conserving relatively benign parasites. And specifically when we start translocating animals, we're moving elephants from here to there, we're removing rhino from here to there, we're removing cheetahs from here to there. But when we're removing the animals, we're also removing their parasites. Now, in the case of a benign parasite, just for the students, is that it's those parasites that not necessarily harm an animal, and sometimes animals can be infected and they will not have any symptoms with it. So that is what we refer to as if we're referring to benign parasites. If we're looking at the IUCN, they do in one of their guidelines looking at the parasites and diseases on the conservation, but the moment we again translocating animals. So that's the only reason why they will take parasites into consideration at all, is if we're translocating an animal that has been extinct, for instance, in the case of the bergkwagga, which with different projects, the populations as well, and then translocating them, the question will be, what will be the role of the parasites as well? Back to the slide that I showed in the beginning, when I referred to the guinea worm, elephantiasis, as well as the eyeworm, one of the things that Carlson and the group also emphasizes in the article is that obviously we will not be able to protect all the and conserve all the parasite species. And there is really wonderful work that has also been done with the eradication of some of these parasites. And the example, for instance, is the guinea worm that you get by drinking water infected with the copepod. The larval stage end up in your digestive system. Eventually, it moves through your lymphatic system into the veins, and then the female will start making irritation, and your skin will burst open and the microfilaria will be shed in the water. And to remove this is to literally wind up the worm on a stick. Another one is elephantiasis, again, where the lymphatic system builds up. So we have programs, the global program to eliminate this filarial diseases that is quite active, and it's happening. If you're also looking for instance, in the case of the malaria eradication, there's a whole article and information on the countries where malaria has been eradicated. Cape Verde Islands have been clear of malaria for the last 3 to 5 years. And the beginning of this year, Egypt was also added onto the list of countries where malaria seems to be under control as well. And then the last one, outreach and education. So this is, how can we as scientists also incorporate parasites to the public? What can we do? And again, it connects to how can we train more parasitologists, and obviously for me it will be the focus on fish parasitologists. So what can we do to really spread the word and to integrate parasitology and the existence of it in our school systems as well? As I said, also providing the training, but also provide the resources. Somewhere along the line, governments must also come to the table and realize the importance that funding, to make funding available for us to be able to do it. And then lastly is awareness of it, and again through the media and educational venues that we have. I'm going to end off with Edward O. Wilson, who was also the father of biodiversity, and he did a lot of work on insects as well. He said one of the oldest ideas in conservation biology is to save species requires naming them. Now, this is where we also have a challenge, is the moment we can identify something, it means we can have a name to it, then we can track it and we can trace it, and we can also use that to tell the story to the public. The challenge is that a small percentage of the parasites have actually been described and assigned scientific names. The other challenge is a lot of them doesn't have common names. I mean, I've been throwing around terminologies like Quinipeltis, we can say Trichodina, we can say Myxobolus. It's not going to mean anything for the public because they cannot relate to it, but they can relate to a Corybastid, they can relate to a rhino. That's my story.
Wow, Professor Loizo, thank you so much. It was so amazing to see how your passion, how you have things that have like the necklace with fish, your plates with fish. It just shows how deeper your passion for fish is. And thank you so much for touching the other part, which most people don't talk about, the conservation part of parasites. Thank you so much. So we're going to open the floor for questions. Dr. Richard Mazabedi, are there any questions from the students, online audience? Do you have any question? You can raise your virtual hand.
Don't seem to have a question from students. Maybe I can ask one on their behalf. So, because the Okavango has a seasonal flooding pattern, can we expect a corresponding load in parasites that more like mirrors the flooding patterns? Thank you.
Richard, thanks for that question. And the interesting thing that we found in the Okavango system is the floodplains is actually the source of parasites. And that is the breeding ground also of a lot of the juvenile fish. And then even if the water is abstracted, the fish goes into the system again. So if we also really want to protect the Okavango system and its fish population, we need to start seriously looking at the floodplains. We seriously need to start taking the cattle out of the floodplains as well. Now, it's one thing quickly to say, but take out the cattle, where are they going to go with it? And that is one of the challenges also with the panhandle section. We have more local people living along the panhandle than we have the local Botswana people living in the delta itself. So again, it's easy going to say, let's protect it, let's take it away. So it's a 50-50, it's a trade-off, but it's something that we need to seriously also look into it. But you're 100% correct. There is a connection between the seasonality of it. Also, you need to take in consideration some of these, that if the parasite that goes through more than one host life cycle as well. So even in the case of the snails, they can estivate, so they can survive harsh conditions. And if they estivate, the Cercaria will estivate with them. So although there's not an immediate release in the water, the moment that it changes, then they will be released in the system as well.
Thank you so much. Any questions? I can see Maret. Maret, can you unmute and ask your question?
I have a simple question. Do you eat sushi, Professor Van As?
Yeah.
No.
No.
Okay.
No. That's obviously for us, it's a different situation. We don't have that much fresh fish. If we're going to have it, it's going to be frozen fish, but no, I don't.
Okay. Just good to know. I will also not be eating sushi anytime soon.
Thank you so much. There is also another all the way from Rwanda.
Yes, thank you, Stella. I really enjoyed this talk and I learned a lot about fish conservation. But I was wondering, I hope you can hear me well.
We can hear you, but you're a bit low, but you can go on.
Yes, I was going to ask about if there are some policies that are put in place on how fish groups or fish cooperatives, let me call it that, they're being given instruction to probably check the healthy status of fish that are being sold to farmers. I think some of them might be they're not healthy to be consumed, but as we have seen, most of fish farmers, they fish the lake fish and they sell them without checking their health status of that fish they're being given. Do you know if there are some regulations that are put in place, or the worldwide or either in your country? Do you have them?
Thank you so much, Tia.
Okay. Diana, I could not hear 100%. It sounds like if you're asking if there's any regulation concerning the fish, the catching of the fish, and also for the fishermen. Was that what you asked?
I will try just to paraphrase what she was asking. She was asking if there is a policy for to do fish inspection before people consume it.
One thing that we okay, if with the consumption of fish, there was not a question of do we eat sushi, and you must also remember the organs, and that's not something that I shown, but the organs where we find the parasites, they will be in the digestive system or they will be in the gills. So even if you buy fish from a fish market, and the fish is still alive, a lot of the time they will be gutted, so you will not get the worms in them. The challenge come in with some of the round worms that infested in the muscle. So if you then eat the raw meat, the raw fish, you can get infected. It's the same way how you can get infected with tapeworms by eating raw pork or raw beef that's not prepared properly. But the moment you fry the fish, or butter the fish, then you will kill the parasites if it is intact in the muscle. And I mean, in the case of the skins, even if you caught the fish, if you remove the scales, you're going to remove the skin. So the chances of getting infected with some of these parasites by handling the fish, they are, but the risk is lower. I hope I answer your question.
Yes, you did. All right, so it seems like there are no any more questions. I just would like to thank you, our speakers, for taking us from explaining how the delta looks like into the fish and then into the parasitology part. We really appreciate, and thank you so much to our students, and thank you to our online audience for participating into today's talk. I hope you're able to explain the ecological and global importance of the Okavango Delta, to recognize the diversity and ecological roles of fish in the Delta, and also to discuss the impact of environmental and human-induced changes on aquatic lives. Thank you so much. I wish you all a good day, a good afternoon. Masana Abuino, that's what we say in Malawi. Masana Abuino. Have a great afternoon.